Now I know what you're thinking, because a lot of you told me in the comments, even though I asked you not to, even though I asked you to wait for part 2. Okay, fine, you're thinking. But you can't possibly think that banning Andrew Tate from social media is a siloed event. If we grant any entity the power to ban people from communicating their thoughts, regardless of how frivolous we think the medium is, there's no actual objective reason that ban couldn't be applied just as easily to anyone else under the right circumstances. This is the bad precedent argument, also called the slippery slope argument, the idea that opening the door to one kind of change introduces the possibility of more changes applied incrementally until we arrive at a state of being that we all, in our current state, agree is undesirable. From the word count on my script, I can tell this video is really in some danger of becoming more of a maxi-sode, and I want to keep it snappy, so let's get into it. The slippery slope argument is extremely interesting to me because it really nicely encompasses the anxiety that everybody has about democracies in general, but no one really wants to admit. That every bad idea is one popular vote away from being implemented. That idea as applied to social media is what I want to explore today. There are 2 arguments in favor of deplatforming that don't exactly break, but certainly bend under scrutiny. The first is that the slippery slope argument is always a fallacy and can therefore be dismissed out of hand. The second is that social media companies are corporations that under a free market system should be able to deplatform anyone they see as a threat to their profit potential. Let's go over each of these and pick them to shreds, shall we? So, slippery slopes are usually horseshit, and furthermore, it's always seemed to me that there's considerable crossover between people who warn against slippery slopes and people who just can't seem to stop slipping down slopes. For example, I got a fair number of comments from people on my last deplatforming video who apparently had very hurt feelings because of their own conflation of men's issues and men's rights with Andrew Tate's rhetoric. Oh man, you're slipping all over the place. Get some tread on those shoes, boys. The problem with Andrew Tate isn't that he's talking about men's issues. The problem is that he explicitly encourages the abuse of women. Failing to see the difference between the two is a slippery slope happening in real time. And that's one problem with this argument. Just because slippery slopes are often internally fallacious doesn't mean they don't happen or that they don't affect discourse. In fact, arguing for deplatforming requires an acknowledgement of this. When we describe people as vulnerable to radicalization, we're basically saying that they're vulnerable to a slippery slope. But what if the people employing a fallacious slippery slope are the ones in charge of hosting the conversation? What then? But let's say the people in charge of social media are perfectly logical and intellectually responsible in every way. Now we have a new problem, which is that slippery slopes are not always fallacious. The way you avoid a slippery slope in your own life is the same way you avoid it in a literal sense. Consider every step you're taking before you take it. The reason a slippery slope argument is usually considered a fallacy is because they typically fail to recognize that different situations are different situations, and every iteration requires its own separate, internally consistent argument. The argument for men's advocacy is a lot different from the argument for defending the systematic emotional abuse of women as a lifestyle choice. The two really don't have much to do with each other. But what about situations where the dividing line between one argument and another isn't as clear? This happens more often than you might think for 2 reasons. The first is that accepting the first stage could change the conditions within which we judge the next iterations in a slippery slope. Google AdSense has suspended payment to anyone who, quote, dismisses, exploits, or condones the war in Ukraine. So now we have to answer a bunch of additional questions to avoid a slippery slope. Does dismissal include protests of involvement in the war? Does condoning include advocacy for involvement in the war? Does exploitation include war journalism? And what really is the difference between discussions about this war compared to any other? As written, this warning could be applied to any war, which should freak you out unless you just can't imagine an unjustified war ever happening again. The second is that language is arbitrary, and every category that humans rely upon to organize thought is basically made up. The AI that runs Facebook's moderation system doesn't understand the concept of reclaiming slurs or sarcasm or ridiculing an idea or a person to make a rhetorical point. Human communication is extremely complicated, much more complicated than the equation-driven structure of social media is built to allow. And that's what I want you to keep in mind for this other argument, which is that this is the free market, bitch! The First Amendment protects you from government retaliation, not access to a website where the primary model of discourse is memes. If you don't like it, go make your own social media network. See how well it does. So let's get one thing out of the way. If you're a hardline capitalist and you're against deplatforming, then you need to reassess your values and either start defending deplatforming or decide you just don't actually like capitalism very much. But though pointing out the hypocrisy of conservatives getting mad about the results of a free market is very fun, that's not where this conversation ends. The film industry is a privatized cultural institution that has been very effectively censored through nothing but political pressure to pretty devastating effect. The government has never censored film. It's just provided guidelines for what it thinks is appropriate for the public to see and breathes down your neck to make sure you follow them. The Hays Code made portraying interracial relationships taboo, and the McCarthy trials resulted in blacklisting that unilaterally ended people's careers for being communist. Today, you can criticize the US military in your movie, just good luck getting it past the MPAA rating system and into theaters. If you claim to care about how Hollywood tropes affect cultural standards and provide justification for oppression purely through aesthetics and narrative structure, then you don't have a whole lot of space to excuse the same thing in social media. Especially since social media is increasingly not just entertainment, but our primary method of communication. As a bit of a political radical myself, I don't love the possibilities for oppression that deplatforming has historically been shown to have. So between the arguments for and against deplatforming, we're left with the great free speech paradox. Free speech is an extremely vulnerable human right that is, by its very nature, constantly threatened both by institutions and individuals that abuse that right. Andrew Tate is trying very hard to convince people that women are universally stupid, immoral, irresponsible, and bereft of honor and integrity, and should therefore never be taken as seriously as men. That is an attack on free speech. But introducing a structure for removing Andrew Tate could be attached to a threat to free speech. As social media exists right now, there are only two options if we want to employ deplatforming as a response to pathologically insecure fuckfaces like Andrew Tate. The first is allowing social media to self-police with, let's be real, probably some light government coercion, and we'll all just have to hope that they deplatform with consistency and responsibility and don't censor videos critiquing anti-vax Facebook groups while leaving the Facebook groups alone, okay? Well, there's always the other option of mob rule. Direct democracy, right? When distasteful ideas show up, make enough of a stink about them that keeping that person online would stand to damage the profit potential of the hosting platform. Make it cheaper to ban them than to keep them around. Mariana, that basically sounds like endorsed cancel culture. That sounds like a really bad idea. It's a terrible idea. Have you seen what people say on Twitter? It's a pretty predictable pattern at this point. When people are trying to get someone banned, they're almost always reduced to lying or extreme exaggeration to stir up outrage and thereby amplify the message further, because the currency of social media is not truth, it is attention. There's lots of hearsay on places like Twitter, lots of very righteous claims to fact, and even more, yes, virtue signaling, with more thought to which side your words place you into than the implication of the words themselves. Literally, like, he's straight up a criminal and probably a sex offender, dude. I think criminals should maybe be deplatformed. Yikes! In order to be effective, online cancel culture basically requires you to metaphorically spray a hose at a rocky hillside in the middle of an ice storm. It's basically the weaponization of a slippery slope. There is no fixing social media in its current state because the problem with social media is not who's running it or who's allowed to stay. The problem with social media is that it is built to make you petty and mean. It redefines the value of human communication in terms of what will be fun for you specifically, and fawningly gives into your every desire before you even knew you wanted it. Why? Because as I said in the last video, social media is not a neutral force. It has an agenda. The agenda is to keep you on the platform as long as possible so they can sell you stuff. But I am begging you, please understand that that is an immoral judgment. Social media platforms have to make money. Everyone has to make money. I have to make money. You have to make money. That's the system we live in. The system doesn't work unless everyone is reliably making money. Every viable long-term solution for fixing social media based on the information we have now requires us to use it less. Not because you should go out and get some fresh air and build some character, although let's not kid ourselves, statistically you should, but because any social media platform that is desirable enough for us to use as constantly as we do will never be a new town square. Ready for an unpopular opinion? One of the best things YouTube ever did was take away the public dislike counter. Was it a decision made entirely to avoid public disapproval on corporate content? Yeah. Does it make it harder to find good tutorial videos? Mm-hmm. But the problem with the dislike counter is well expressed in YouTube co-founder Jawed Karim's statement mourning its demise. The ability to easily and quickly identify bad content is an essential feature of a user-generated content platform. Why? Because not all user-generated content is good. It can't be. In fact, most of it is not good. And that's okay. The process works and there's a name for it. The wisdom of the crowds. The process breaks when the platform interferes with it. Then the platform invariably declines. Does YouTube want to become a place where everything is mediocre? Oh my God, easily and quickly identifying someone's opinion as good or bad without actually having to engage with it is exactly the kind of thing we don't want people to do. You know, it sounds in that quote like he's doing the free marketplace of ideas bad argument, but I don't think he is. I don't think he's speaking as a consumer. He's speaking as a co-founder of YouTube. When he says good and bad, he doesn't mean morally good and bad. He means fun and not fun. The problem with the deplatforming conversation is that every side wants a solution that doesn't require social media to change structurally at all. Deplatforming is probably a good short-term treatment for really malignant tumors like Andrew Tate, but it will never be a tactic we can trust, and it will never address the central cancer of social media, which is that it is capitalist in body and soul. Its values are competition, dominance, and exponential growth, and none of those things should be acceptable for any productive communication technology. So, yep, as long as social media is obligated to care more about profit than healthy communication, there is no solution to this. Sorry, this is a channel about bad news and upsetting realities. But I know that's kind of a bummer ending, and that's bad for the algorithm. So I'll try and end on what I think might be okay policy advice short of ending capitalism, because I'm a good American and no good American wants to end capitalism. Okay, so the public dislike counter is not gone forever. The technological framework for it still exists, and there are free plugins that you can download to bring it back for your own use. And that is a good example of an opt-in policy, which is a little trick behavioral economists do to influence people's choices without removing them altogether. The classic example of how this works is the opt-out organ donation policy a lot of countries in Europe have. When you get your driver's license, instead of specifying that you do want to donate your organs, you have to specify that you don't. And that difference alone makes the organ donation rate rise from 15% to 90%. This works every time because, as we went over in the last video, human beings are not logical and easy to manipulate. Making social media users have to opt into seeing certain people, topics, recommendations, etc. would probably be annoying, but it would have an effect. Of course, policies like this would necessarily be limited to things that would continue to keep platforms as entertaining and addictive as possible so they can keep making money. But maybe an effect is the best we can hope for. Bye-bye!